The second reason that Pope Francis recommends that all of us read more literature, and I think this is perhaps the most important point, I think this is why ultimately he wrote the document, because he's the Pope, right? He's concerned with preaching the gospel. He's concerned with evangelizing. He's concerned with bringing other people to Jesus Christ. And
I want to talk about this real quick, Joey, this point you're making, because earlier today in Mass, I was like, why is it that we should care what the Pope has to say generally? And I know it sounds kind of bold because I'm a seminarian deacon, soon to be a priest. But like, why should we care what Rome has to say, what the Pope has to say? Well, because for many years of Western history, you know, several hundred centuries, Rome spoke for all of culture. People looked to Rome for what culture and society was supposed to be shaped after, right? And for many of those years, the Roman pontiff held the throne, the chair that spoke for kind of the pivoting way, the method, the shape, the heart of culture. He spoke to its heart, to its needs, and also to its goodness. And so the papacy, the popes, will write these documents not just because they're sitting from the throne trying to kind of dictate decrees of what's good and what's bad, or what's the sins of the world. They're sitting there to try to kind of help pivot humanity as to where he is or not to go. You know, and in that sense, like you said, carry out the evangelical mission of the church.
That's a good point. I would just respond to that by saying we shouldn't just listen to the Pope because historically people listen to the Pope.
Correct.
Right. The reason that historically people listen to the Pope and that we should continue to listen to the Pope is because he is the vicar of Christ on earth. Correct. Right? And it's a divinely instituted office. But yes, exactly what you're saying. The Pope is concerned with shaping the hearts of humanity, slowly leading them towards the gospel. And he's telling us in this document that it's beneficial for all of us to read more literature. And the second reason that he gives for this is because if we are going to preach the gospel to human beings, we need to know those human beings. We need to know their hearts so that we can preach the gospel in a way that's attractive to them. And so what Pope Francis says is reading literature does precisely that. It helps us know the heart of man. It helps us know our own hearts. That was the first point. But it helps us know the heart of man so that we can effectively preach the gospel to him.
Correct. He has this quote, which I think is very powerful. He says, for Christians, nothing that is human is indifferent. Right? So life of faith doesn't navigate or work or talk or read the world with this attitude of indifference.
No.
The eyes of faith actually open us up to see that the world is purposeful.
And that humanity in particular. And why is that? Well, it's because God became man.
Right. God became man and viewed it with just a beautiful dignity that we're called to enter into, as you were talking about, on the one hand, to get to know our own heart, but to get to know the heart of man so as to prepare it for the word.
Yes. Yes. Right. And, you know, there's one kind of strategy for preaching the gospel that I don't recommend that is pretty much, I'm going to come in with the gospel truth and impose it upon you and just tell you what you should believe and that this is true and you should become Christian now. Right. And no one is going to respond to that.
You know why? I have a theory.
All right. Tell me your theory.
That truth doesn't work in that the gospel does not work in that fashion because it undermines the nature of truth. The nature of truth necessarily involves the subject, because truth is a person, and so it involves our personhood to be able to understand it in the way that we know how. In the tradition, we have what's called divine pedagogy, right? Like our Lord came down at the time where man was ready, more or less. He had prepared throughout salvation history a group of people. Then it expanded, and he entered history, right? He didn't just after the fall, clear the ground, and send everybody to heaven. That's not what happened. What he did is he tried to teach us. He walks with us, and then he became one of us to help us enter into that salvific act.
Yeah, and when he came, he didn't just force the gospel down our throats.
He also didn't come as a king.
He invited us to accept it freely. Correct. And I guess that's the point I'm trying to make. If you want to preach the gospel, you don't impose it on others. You have to invite them to accept it freely. And before you do that, you have to know them. Yeah. And like Jesus came to know us, he became like us in all things but sin, right? He experienced every aspect of our human experience. We were reading about the Jesuit missionaries today in our American church history class, how they came over and literally, before they even preached the gospel, they just started living the life of these, they were Indians living in Canada at the time, right? In Quebec. And they just, that's what they did first. They were just, can we just share life with you? Can we just get to know you? Can we just listen to you and discover who you are and see the beauty of your culture?
How do you worship God exactly?
Right. They just get to know them. And then only after they've established that relationship, they preach the gospel. Well, Pope Francis is saying we need to preach the gospel. That needs to be our strategy. And what literature does is it helps us to listen to the heart of man. It helps us to grow in empathy for the people by whom we're surrounded. It helps us to know the deep questions that man is wrestling with so that we can respond to those questions in love. So many of us are crippled in our ability to really listen to another and really to empathize with another. It's because in this climate that we live in right now, in our political system, especially in America, it's just so divisive. People just talk past each other. They don't listen. But Pope Francis is saying, no, reading literature it's not just life experience for you. It's also practice, like concrete practice of listening to the heart and the voice of another.
Yeah. And that's the thing, Jay, it's been my own personal experience too. Like when I read, it forces me to almost enter into dialogue with the author.
Yes,
right?
exactly.
And I'm oftentimes in dialogue with myself, which means that I'm sane for one, but it also just means that like it can be very easy to fall into the kind of the all-encompassing self.
Yes.
But literature kind of forces us to listen.
Breaks you out of that.
Right.